It was a warm, golden evening in downtown Arlington. The streets pulsed with life, echoing with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the faint melody of a street musician strumming his guitar. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as people darted in and out of cozy cafes and brightly lit boutique shops. Among the crowd, Elijah Grant, a decorated Navy SEAL on leave, strolled with a sense of quiet purpose. Dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, well-fitted jeans, and worn sneakers, Elijah exuded an effortless confidence. His lean, muscular frame moved with a calm grace, the kind of poise that came from years of discipline and training. Slung over his shoulder was a weathered leather messenger bag, the kind that had seen countless journeys yet held its dignity intact. For once in a long time, Elijah's mind felt light. No missions, no pressure, just a quiet evening to pick up a book he'd been meaning to read for months. As he crossed a bustling intersection, the world around him seemed to shift. The faint screech of tires broke through the urban symphony, followed by the heavy rumble of an approaching police car. It wasn't unusual in a city like this, but something about the deliberate stop of the vehicle felt different. The car came to a halt just a few feet away, the flashing lights casting sharp reflections on nearby shop windows. Elijah's steps faltered as the doors swung open with a creak. A white police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped out with a measured slowness that felt calculated. His uniform was pristine, the badge on his chest catching the fading sunlight. His name tag read Cardon, and his piercing blue eyes locked onto Elijah like a predator sizing up its prey. "Hey, you!" Cardon barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Elijah paused mid-step, turning his head calmly to meet the officer's gaze. The chatter around them dimmed slightly, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as a few pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing the brewing tension. "You're in a bit of a hurry, aren't you?" Cardon continued, his tone laced with suspicion. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, slicing through the warmth of the evening. Elijah's dark eyes remained steady, his expression unreadable. "Just heading to the bookstore," he replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. Cardon folded his arms, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Bookstore, huh? That bag of yours. What's in it? You carrying anything I should know about?" The implication was clear. Elijah felt the weight of the officer's gaze and the faint hum of prejudice woven into his words. Around them, the crowd thickened slightly. Some people walked on, pretending not to notice, while others lingered, their curiosity piqued. Phones began to emerge discreetly from pockets, their cameras ready to capture whatever might unfold. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression remaining calm. "You want to check?" he asked, his tone steady, almost challenging. Cardon straightened, visibly taken aback by Elijah's lack of fear. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped, though his voice wavered slightly. A beat of silence passed, heavy with unspoken tension. Cardon's hand hovered near his utility belt, a subtle yet deliberate move that didn't go unnoticed by the growing crowd. Elijah, still relaxed, shifted his weight slightly, his presence commanding despite his calm demeanor. "All right, officer," Elijah said, his voice as steady as before. "Let's do this the right way." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder as the air crackled with tension. Elijah's composure, unshaken by the officer's implied threat, seemed to throw Cardon off balance. The officer squared his shoulders and took a step closer, his boots clinking faintly against the pavement. "Drop the bag," Cardon demanded, his tone harsher now, as though raising his voice might mask his uncertainty. Elijah's expression remained unreadable. He carefully removed the bag from his shoulder and held it out. "Sure," he said after a moment, his calmness radiating an undeniable strength. It wasn't submission, it was strategy. Cardon snatched the bag with more force than necessary, his smirk faltering as he fumbled with the zipper. Elijah's gaze never left him, steady and unflinching, a quiet power that seemed to unsettle the officer further. The crowd continued to grow, their phones now openly recording as whispers rippled through the air. The tension was almost tangible, a silent battle of wills unfolding between the officer and the Navy SEAL. Elijah remained still, his calm demeanor unbroken, his very presence a challenge to the authority that had unjustly singled him out. Cardon tightened his grip on the bag, his movements deliberate as he unzipped it with a sense of authority that was beginning to feel forced. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity palpable. Phones were now pointed openly, capturing every moment as though it were the climax of a tense drama. "Hands behind your back," Cardon barked suddenly, his voice echoing sharply in the charged silence. His hand hovered near the cuffs on his belt, ready to escalate. Elijah raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice firm and steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're being detained," Cardon shot back, his words clipped and defensive. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like a bad joke, eliciting murmurs and incredulous glances from the crowd. A woman near the front, her phone raised, muttered audibly, "Here we go again." Elijah gave a slow nod, his lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He wasn't angry. He was measured, calculating. "All right, Officer Cardon," he said evenly, his tone carrying a hint of quiet amusement. "Let me help you out." Cardon stiffened as Elijah stepped forward slightly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The officer's hand hovered near his weapon, his nerves visibly fraying. "Relax," Elijah said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I'm just giving you my ID." With painstaking care, Elijah reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sleek card holder. From it, he extracted a small, polished card and extended it toward the officer. Cardon hesitated, his eyes darting between Elijah's face and the ID. When he finally took it, his smirk faltered as his gaze scanned the card. The name, the rank, and the unmistakable emblem of the United States Navy SEALs stared back at him. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the revelation. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, but his voice edged with subtle amusement. "Still think I fit the description?" The crowd, sensing the shift in power, leaned in closer. The tension in the air buzzed like an electric current as phones recorded every second of Cardon's faltering authority. Cardon clenched his jaw, the smirk long gone from his face. He tossed the ID back to Elijah with a flick of his wrist, a gesture meant to reassert control but only revealing his growing frustration. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," he muttered, his voice lacking its earlier edge. "Stay put while I check your bag." Elijah caught the ID effortlessly and slipped it back into his pocket. Crossing his arms, he watched as Cardon bent down to rummage through the leather messenger bag. "Go ahead," Elijah said, his tone calm but now laced with a quiet, cutting confidence. "Make sure to show everyone what you find." The officer unzipped the bag fully and began rifling through its contents. The crowd edged closer, the faint hum of murmurs growing louder. Inside, the bag's contents were neatly arranged, almost with military precision. A folded book, a stainless steel water bottle, and a sleek black laptop. Cardon's fingers brushed against the book, and he pulled it out as though it might contain something incriminating. Holding it up, he scrutinized the title as if it were a secret code. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "That's a book I wrote," he replied evenly, his tone carrying a faint trace of amusement. The title, Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence, was emblazoned in bold letters across the cover. The irony was not lost on the crowd, which began murmuring softly, some even chuckling at the unfolding scene. Cardon blinked, momentarily thrown off. "You wrote this?" he repeated, the disbelief evident in his tone. "That's what I said," Elijah replied smoothly, tilting his head slightly. "Would you like me to autograph it for you? Or are you just planning to keep rummaging through my things?" A ripple of laughter coursed through the crowd, and Cardon's face flushed red with embarrassment. He shoved the book back into the bag with more force than necessary, his frustration evident. "Cut the attitude," he snapped, though his voice now lacked the conviction it had earlier. Elijah raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, you're the one making a scene," he said calmly, his tone sharp enough to slice through Cardon's defenses. "I'm just trying to go about my day." The officer ignored the comment and continued his search, pulling out the laptop next. He inspected it with the intensity of someone determined to find something, anything, that might justify his actions. When that failed, he turned his attention to the last item in the bag, a small, leather-bound journal. Opening it, Cardon flipped through its pages, his brow furrowing as he scanned the neat, precise handwriting. The journal contained Elijah's thoughts, reflections, and experiences from deployments overseas. One particular entry caught Cardon's eye. You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power. It's about service. For a brief moment, Cardon froze. The words seemed to strike a chord, resonating in a way he wasn't prepared for. The crowd, however, grew restless, their patience wearing thin. Anything illegal in there, officer? Elijah asked, his tone polite but laced with a quiet challenge. Cardon slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag. His face was a mix of frustration and unease, the confidence he'd walked in with now replaced by visible discomfort. "You're free to go," he barked, stepping back as though trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. Elijah didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Not so fast," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You stopped me, accused me of fitting a description, and rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people. I think we're owed an explanation." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of support. Some shouted phrases like, "What's the reason?" and "You can't just walk away." Phones zoomed in on Cardon's face, capturing every crack in his composure. Elijah stood tall, calm, and unflinching, his very presence making it impossible for Cardon to brush off the growing scrutiny. The officer shifted uncomfortably, the authority he had once wielded now slipping from his grasp. The weight of the moment bore down on Officer Cardon like a storm cloud. The crowd's expectant silence amplified his discomfort, and the pressure was undeniable. Beads of sweat dotted his brow as his gaze darted between Elijah and the sea of phones recording his every move. The authority he had wielded so confidently earlier now seemed to slip through his fingers. Cardon stammered, his voice cracking. "I was just acting on suspicion, doing my duty to ensure public safety." The crowd groaned in unison. His feeble excuse ignited murmurs of disbelief and frustration. A man in the front shook his head. "Same old story," he muttered. A woman holding her phone high called out, "What suspicion? Say it plainly." Elijah's stance didn't falter, his tall frame exuding quiet power. His gaze was steady, calm, and piercing all at once. Taking a deliberate step closer, he locked eyes with Cardon, his voice sharp yet measured. "Suspicion?" Elijah repeated, letting the word linger in the air. "Let me make this perfectly clear, officer. Suspicion isn't a license to harass. It's not an excuse to stop someone without cause. And it's certainly not justification for targeting someone because of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices growing louder. Some nodded, others shouted in support, but all eyes remained fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Cardon's face turned beet red, his lips parting as if to respond, but no words came out. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but tinged with a sharp edge. "Let me guess," Elijah continued, his voice slicing through the officer's silence. "Black man walking down the street, minding his own business? That about sums it up, doesn't it?" Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of, "He said it," and "Exactly." The tension in the air was electric, every second stretching into an eternity. Cardon's jaw tightened, his composure crumbling further under the weight of Elijah's unflinching gaze and the crowd's growing support. "You want to talk about suspicion?" Elijah pressed on, his tone gaining momentum. "What about the fact that you didn't stop anyone else here? What about the fact that you rifled through my belongings, accused me of fitting some vague description, and tried to paint me as a threat, all without a shred of evidence?" Cardon's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. But there was none. The crowd was now fully engaged, their collective energy turning against him. "I wasn't singling you out," Cardon blurted, though his voice lacked conviction. It was a desperate attempt to claw back control, but the crowd saw through it. Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unyielding. "Oh, you weren't," he shot back, his voice dripping with quiet indignation. "Then explain why I'm the only one standing here. Explain why you thought you could intimidate me without consequence." The crowd roared in support. Shouts of "Yeah, explain yourself," and "We're waiting," filled the air. Cardon took a step back, his earlier arrogance now completely replaced by desperation. Elijah's gaze didn't waver as he addressed the crowd, his voice carrying effortlessly over the noise. "This isn't just about me," he said, his tone commanding and resolute. "This is about every person who's been stopped, questioned, or harassed for no reason. This is about a system that lets this kind of behavior go unchecked." The crowd responded with thunderous applause, their voices rising in solidarity. Elijah turned back to Cardon, his expression one of quiet determination. "You didn't expect me to push back, did you?" Elijah said, his voice calm but piercing. "You thought you could get away with this because you've done it before. But not today. Today, you're the one under scrutiny." Cardon's face was pale now, the realization of his mistake sinking in. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind only the weight of accountability. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for everyone to see. "Here's the deal, officer," he said, his voice firm. "You're going to stand here and explain yourself in front of all these people." Or, he let the implication hang in the air, tapping the screen of his phone. Cardon's eyes widened as he realized Elijah had been recording the entire encounter. Panic flickered across his face as the crowd leaned in, their anticipation palpable. "You don't owe me an apology," Elijah continued, his tone razor-sharp. "You owe every single person here an explanation. So go ahead. Talk." The crowd fell silent, their attention laser-focused on Cardon. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around, his gaze flicking from Elijah to the recording phones and back again. "Say something," someone called from the crowd. Others joined in, their voices growing louder with each passing second. Cardon's shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment too much to bear. He began, but his voice trailed off. The truth was glaringly obvious to everyone present. There had never been a description, just an excuse. Elijah stepped forward, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "This is your moment, officer," he said, his tone almost pitying. "You can admit your mistake, or you can let this moment define you forever. The choice is yours." The crowd waited, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Cardon glanced around, his face a mixture of shame and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, the sound of applause erupted from the back of the crowd. The crowd waited, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Cardon glanced around, his face a mixture of shame and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, the sound of applause erupted from the back of the crowd. Elijah turned to see a woman stepping forward, her phone still raised. "Thank you for standing up," she said, her voice firm. "Thank you for showing us all what it means to lead with integrity." The applause grew, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Elijah gave a small nod, his expression one of quiet gratitude. Cardon, now completely out of his depth, muttered something inaudible before turning on his heel and walking away. The crowd jeered, their voices chasing him down the street. Elijah watched him go, his stance relaxed but his presence still commanding. He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying above the noise. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "Not for me, not for any of us. We can't let moments like this pass without action. If we want change, we have to demand it." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy now focused on a new purpose. Elijah stood tall, his calm gaze sweeping over the faces of those around him. For the first time that day, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity and resolve.